Biological evolution, often called Darwin's theory, is a scientific theory that proposes that all life on Earth advanced from a single living entity, often called the last universal common ancestor. The theory states that evolution creates all species of plant and animal life that exist on the Earth now, and all species that have ever existed and maybe now extinct. These species are numbered in the millions. But is evolution really a proven fact, as many scientists say, or is it a failed scientific theory? I will try to shed some light on that subject in the next hour. We looked at the theological implications of Darwinian evolution, and the reason I say reason I kind of condition it with Darwinian evolution is because there's several different theories of evolution going around, but the primary one, the one that's taught in high schools and schools around the public schools around the world, is Darwinian evolution, Darwin's theory. As he set out in this little book called On the Origin of Species in 1859. And we're going to talk about, we talked about the theological implications. What does the Scripture say about it? And as we saw last week, it says quite a bit, but we really couldn't conclude. You remember, we couldn't draw a hard, fast conclusion about it because it said God brought forth, He made, He formed, and He created. And the theistic evolutionists, the Christians who believe in evolution, and there are a lot of them, I used to be one of them, say, well, that sounds a lot like evolution, forming and making, and as opposed to just creating. But it also said, and it used this little Hebrew word mean 11 times in the creation story and 18 times in the early part of Genesis, referring back to the creation story, that from one kind came another of the same kind. Now that doesn't sound so much like evolution, okay? So we had these two little ideas in there that we found that kind of left us kind of inconclusive, at least I think so. And my personal opinion is that the Scriptures do not preclude some form of evolution. As we saw, microevolution is a fact. Within a species, you can make turn a German Shepherd into a Jack Russell Terrier if you're patient enough. And that's kind of that's actually kind of artificial evolution. But he doesn't turn into a daffodil. So that's what Darwin was trying to sell in his little book, the fact that we could, from one species, we could create another species. Now, we looked at, we researched the origin of life. Remember that, the little warm pond, Darwin's. Now, he didn't talk about this in this book. He wrote some letters and another book later on that talked about his opinion about how life originated. Actually, Darwin said that pretty much in this book that the first life was created by God. And then from that single cell evolved into all of the plant and animal life that we see. But he kind of rethought that a little later on, and a few years later he came out talking about the warm little pond full of chemicals, chemically rich, which it undoubtedly was at that point in time in the formation of the earth, the early earth. And but we also talked about the impossible chemistry of such a thing as creating even a protein, a single protein. Like Vanderbilt University in 2011, 242 amino acids long. And I don't think there's a protein in a cell that short. The shortest one I know of is about 500 or 400. So the best laboratory in the United States, for sure, in the world, can't even come close to doing what's happening in your cells right now as we're sitting here, just ginning out these little proteins, dividing cells, that sort of thing.
Even though it might seem absurd that fragile organic compounds, such as proteins, could have assembled themselves in the extremely harsh conditions of the early Earth in such a short period of time, I have vastly overstated the complexity of such a thing. In addition to the problems with synthesis of even the most basic prebiotics, such as amino acids and simple sugars and phosphates, I didn't mention the presence of chemicals that would quickly change these molecules. Oxidation, chlorination, and hydrolysis would change these materials into useless compounds. These fragile materials have a very short half-life and would disappear quickly. Contaminants such as clay, a material known to be a catalyst, would work against self-assembly. The problems are so great that many scientists have abandoned the search for a natural pathway to life on Earth.
Then we looked at the living cell. We didn't get through that. We're going to finish it tonight. And saw what an amazing thing it is. When you slice it open like the picture I showed, it's just full of little machine shops and chemical plants and manufacturing plants and power plants and computers and things that make things. Because if you're going to duplicate a cell, you gotta have the capability to duplicate everything in that cell, right? The DNA, all of these little organelles that are in there. Which is unbelievable, because you're making all these complicated proteins that the best labs in the world can't make. Okay. Now DNA it's the twisted ladder. Everybody's familiar with it. The rails of that ladder are called the backbone, and they're made up of a sequence of phosphate and sugar molecules. Just phosphate, sugar, phosphate, sugar, phosphate, sugar. Just long. 6 feet long in every cell. And the 50 or 60 or 70 trillion cells in your body, so that's a lot of DNA. So that's what the rails are made of. The ladder rungs are made out of amino acids. Now, there are hundreds of possible amino acids. Amino acid is a very simple chemical compound, right, Grady? I mean, it's it's a small little molecule. It's easy to understand and look at. It's not all that easy to. I almost said it's easy to make, but it's not all that easy to make. But there's only 4 out of all of those hundreds of possibilities that are in DNA. Adenine, guanine, thymine, and cytosine. They call them AGTC. A lot of times you'll see well, up there even they have the rungs. And it takes 2 to make a ladder rung. So half of the ladder rung is one and half is another, but they have to be in a certain combination. It has to be cytosine, guanine, adenine, and thymine. Adenine cannot chemically combine with a guanine, for instance. Now they can be flip-flopped. But that's the only combination. So what it is, it's a real simple computer language. Now what's really important about it, and this, I can't stress this enough, and it's kind of easy for somebody who's really hadn't had a lot of science to understand. The important thing about it is not how it's built. What's important about it is where those ladder rungs are. Because and I'm going to say the position of the ladder rung. Because if you were to start swapping them around, just, or when they duplicate, they were getting all mixed up. The the position of those ladder rungs determine whether you're a cat or a chrysanthemum. I mean, it's everything from conception to death, and every operation of the body is in that computer code. So if you composed a computer program, which I've done lots of times, and you miss a instruction, or you drop one digit. We used to call it dropping a digit. I mean, you can have a number off by one digit, and the computer program won't work. In fact, sometimes you have to turn the power off. I mean, it just gets in a do loop or does something crazy. And we used to control these big chemical plants with these things, so it was real important that we didn't mess up. And we might have a program that had 2,000 or 3,000 lines of code in it, and one digit. Now, we weren't using DNA, but we were using something very similar. One digit would screw the whole thing up. And that's what happens in your cell. One of those nucleotide pairs flip-flopped. If you've got a CG and it ends up duplicating as a GC, it's bad. If you got a CG and when it duplicates somehow it ends up being an AT, that's bad. And what is that called when that happens? Genetic mutation. That's part of the definition of Darwinian evolution we're going to see in a minute. There are three in a human now. In a daffodil, there's a different number. But in a human, there are 3.2 billion, with a B, of those ladder rungs in every cell in your body. One of them flip-flops, substitutes. Something bad's going to happen. Now, it may be, if it's in a somatic cell, which we're going to talk about later, in other words, skin or, things that make up your body, it could be something as simple as a wart or something as bad as a cancer. Just that one little flip-flop. So see how fragile this all is? It's almost kind of scary. We talked about this last week. The ladder rungs are called nucleotide pairs or base pairs. If you want to impress your friends, you call it nucleotide pairs. If you don't care about that, you call it base pairs. And we talked about codons and triplets. We don't have time to go back over that, but that's a codon. Three of those in consecutive order code for a single amino acid in a protein chain of maybe 30,000 long. So
DNA is found in every living cell and every living organism on Earth, whether it's a plant or an animal or a bacteria or a mushroom. Every living cell contains DNA. Since it's exactly the same in every living organism, naturalists claim that this is compelling evidence for evolution, and it certainly can't be denied. However, any engineer will tell you that standard systems are common in design. The electrical systems in a chemical factory are the same as those in a furniture store, a warehouse, or even in your home. It's only a matter of scale. Many standard systems, such as instrument systems, piping systems, structural systems, are used by engineers. Engineers rarely reinvent a system, but instead use standard designs. The argument for DNA can, therefore, be used as a compelling argument for design as well.
When a cell divides, and a mutation occurs, several potential outcomes. Number one outcome, it could have no effect at all. And that would be if in that piece of DNA that mutated is what they call non-coding. In other words, it's just laying there. It's not participating in any way. and I'm not going to get into all that either, but a lot of the DNA in your 3.2 billion just sit there most of the time because they are used for different things, like building a heart muscle. When your heart's built, you want it to turn off, right? I mean, if your DNA is building your heart muscle when you're still in the womb, when that heart gets finished, guess what? Let's turn that off. Well, see, that DNA is turned off. Very amazing. I mean, incredibly amazing. So there's a lot of DNA that's turned off, and so if a mutation occurs in some of those nucleotides, then there's no problem. Oh, another example of one that has no effect or neutral would be if you had a mutation that caused your eyes to be blue rather than brown. So what? You know, no big deal. You're not going to die of brown eyes. And there's lots of examples: hair color, skin texture, height. I mean, there's a lot of those kind of things. Those are all considered neutral or of no effect. Another thing is they can be beneficial. Now, these are extremely rare. In fact, it's questionable if they even exist. The evolutionists definitely think they exist, and they can give you some examples. But a beneficial genetic mutation is a mutation that actually is beneficial to your body. Let's say humans are prone, Grady and I were talking about it before we started, prone to plaque in arteries, all right, that cause heart attacks. Everybody knows about that. I certainly do. And if you had a genetic mutation that, say, resulted in the fact that your arteries didn't build up any plaque, that'd be pretty cool, right? That would be a beneficial genetic mutation. In fact, there's a group of people in Italy that actually have that mutation. A bunch of people in Italy that have extremely low instances of plaque in arteries. Now, they're not turning into daffodils. That's all microevolution. Just like some of them are, there are populations with tall people. But that particular thing you would judge as a beneficial mutation. Now, like I say, they are extremely rare and very controversial. For instance, sickle cell anemia. Anybody ever heard of sickle cell anemia? It's prevalent in African Americans. In fact, I don't know of a case in a Caucasian. I'm sure there is. It's a genetic disease that, all right, your blood cells look like frisbees, right? And if I took a frisbee and I bent it at a right angle, can you imagine that? Bent it at a right angle, that's what a sickle cell looks like. And there's a gene, there's one of these flip-flop base pairs caused that. And what it does is it eventually causes early death, because you can imagine that thing would be clogging up just about everything. Now, what would you think geneticists would you think they would call that a beneficial mutation? That's one of them. That's a beneficial genetic mutation. Now, I know I got you confused. Let me explain. In Africa, sickle cell anemia is very common, but the biggest killer in Africa is what? Anybody know? Malaria. Malaria. I mean, there's nothing even close. And guess what? A person with sickle cell anemia will never die of malaria, because the sickle cell somehow retards or blocks or does something to keep the malaria from taking hold. So think of this logic now. It's beneficial to an African in Africa, not so much for one living in Chicago, for instance. So, it's controversial. I would say, hey, it's detrimental, but that's how controversial some of this stuff is, just to give you an example. Okay, so we got no effect, beneficial, then we got detrimental. There are currently over 4,000 diseases. Many of them fatal, all of them bad, caused by genetic mutation. Almost every kind of cancer you can imagine. Parkinson's disease, Down syndrome, all of those things are genetic in nature. And just because you have one of those doesn't mean your offspring are going to have it. Because this gene has to be, this mutation has to be passed on through the sex cells, which we're going to get into in a minute, before that can happen. Now, in humans, it's easy to calculate. There's 4,000 detrimental genetic mutations to every one beneficial one. There's a 4,000 to 1 chance if you have a genetic mutation that's not neutral, it's going to be bad. And just think about what the implications of that might be for the evolutionary process. Now, another thing, and I'll just mention this, if your cell ends up with multiple mutations, for some reason you had 3 or 4 or 5 or 6, generally that cell will die. It won't, it'll just, when it reproduces, the cell will die and be redissolved. Because the cell can only handle a few of those, 1 or 2 of those mutations is all it can handle, which is another problem for the theory of evolution, because these changes must be so small that they're only represented by 1 out of 3.2 billion nucleotide pairs. Tiny, tiny little changes. Cell division, when the cell divides, the DNA has to be also divided. Now, there are 2 kinds of cells in your bodies. One is what doctors call somatic cells, or non-sex cells, like your skin and anything from the tip of your toes to the top of your head are somatic cells. And you have about 50, 60, 70 trillion of those in your body. And if you have a wart caused by a virus called human papillomavirus, or if you have colon cancer, or if you have any number of things, breast cancer, whatever, it occurs in these somatic cells, and it's not part of your heredity, okay? When you die, it dies with you. The other kind of cell are the sex cells, or what the doctors call the germ cells. Now, those are the ones that get involved in reproduction. And instead of trillions of those, there's only a few. They're in the billions, but compared to the number of cells in your body, the number of sex cells that you have are minute. Because in order for you to receive a mutated cell from a parent, it has to go that way. And I'm going to show you how that works a bit in a minute. Anybody ever heard of a ribosome? You remember I told you how difficult it was to build a protein? Vanderbilt built one about that. Well, microscopic, obviously. Little bitty thing. That thing's got 50 proteins in it. 50 proteins and 7 RNA molecules in it. So that thing must be, 50 times as complex, right? Because now that you got these long, big wads of protein, they start sticking together in a certain way, and they make that ribosome, which is a machine. And what this machine does is it takes RNA, which is like a half of, you take the DNA and split it down the middle, and you got half, you've got the components. RNA looks a lot like that. It's a little bit different, but that's a good way of thinking of it. It's just got the little stub end sticking up. That ribosome takes that RNA and it sticks in there somewhere, and out comes a brand new protein. It is what manufactures the new protein based on the positions of those little nucleotide pairs. It takes 3 of those little nucleotides to make one amino acid and thousands of them to make one protein. That molecule is so complex that it's never been synthesized, and even, 242 out of, 50 proteins it takes to put that thing together. Now, can you even imagine, can it even come close to imagining that all happening by just kind of random chance? That'd be like building an engine in a car by chance. And the pistons would be one protein, and the crankshaft would be another protein, and the engine block would be another protein, and the flywheel would be another protein, and on and on and on. And it just kind of puts itself together. That might be a nice to think about, but I don't know if you laid all those parts out in the shop floor, if you come back the next morning, you're going to have an engine sitting there. I doubt it. But that's what I call the naturalists. It's what they say kind of happened early on. Ribosome. All right, now we're going to talk about DNA replication in a somatic cell. Now you have, I mentioned this before, you have 2 strands of DNA in your body, one that came from your mother at conception and one that came from your daddy at conception. So you're walking around and every cell in your body's got a piece of your mom and dad in it, which is kind of cool to think about. And so what happens, this process of mitosis takes, and it's a 6-step process we're not going to get into. It's very technical. Miles, who's fast asleep back there, could tell you how it's done. They teach it in the 8th grade, okay? So we go through this process of mitosis, and we get 2 identical DNA, and then the cell splits. Okay, now, mitosis, that's all you have to remember. If you're interested in the 6 steps, then you can check that out on the internet. Now let's look at this. Suppose that dear old mom had a genetic problem, something that codes for something bad. Okay, that's what happens. She passes that on to the next cell. But is that a problem for the offspring? No. That may be like a breast cancer, let's say. The cell just keeps dividing and getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And because once you have a mutation, it's like making copies of a document with a misspelled word. It keeps repeating the problem. So that's how the thing grows, okay, the mutated cell. Now in a germ cell, it's different. All right, now these cells aren't produced. These cells are produced in the sex organs, okay. I don't want to get too explicit, but here's how. But they're produced by a completely different process. Just absolutely different, which you wouldn't expect. At least I wouldn't. And this is what it looks like. So there's dad and there's mom. There are little DNA chains in your cells, and they're chopped up, by the way, into 23 chromosomes, the little X-shaped things you've seen sometimes. And they're pairs. But in the sex cells, then this is female and male, they only produce a single strand. Instead of two strands, like every cell in your body, your somatic cells have, the sex cells, the sperm and the egg, we call it, only have a single strand of DNA. Now look how it's built. This is pretty cool. It's like pop beads. Pieces of the paternal DNA come out and they make up the new strand. So you'll have a couple of, you have some of your mama and then some of your daddy and then a little bit more of your daddy and then another big piece of your mama and on and on. That's the way it works. Can y'all see, does that thing tell you what I'm trying to explain to you? And when that thing gets through, there's not two, but there's a single strand of DNA that is completely different from either your mama or your daddy. Starting to make sense now? Y'all got that? Now that's called meiosis. And that only occurs in the sex organs and the sex cells that produce the sex cells. It gets more interesting. Now the little yellow things are genetic mutations. Say both mom and dad has something. Dad's got Parkinson's disease and mom's got whatever, something else. But you see up in the top, the meiosis selected the piece of dear old dad's DNA that had the problem in it. But the problem that mother had didn't get selected in this. They call it shuffling. They call it gene shuffling. That's why you can have someone who has a problem, a serious health problem like Parkinson's disease, and it may be passed on to an offspring, or it may not. You see how that works? The daddy had Parkinson's, guess what? The offspring's going to have Parkinson's. But the mother had something else, and guess what? The offspring's not going to have it. Now, it's certainly possible that neither one of them would have been transferred because the piece that was picked out did not end up in the new strand of DNA. Now, scientists tell us there are 70 trillion possible combinations like you see on the right. 70 trillion possible U's that are different. I'm trying to tell you that the process for making a new person is completely different than the process of making a new cell, because you can have, like my two grandsons, built different personalities, different physical capabilities. Fortunately, both of them are very smart, extremely smart. Jules, I saw he must be awake. They're both beautiful like their mother, and thank God that worked out that way. So, but anyway, that's why we're all different. That's why we don't. Now, there is a possible difference, and that's identical twins, but that happens after conception. That happens when the first cell divides. Instead of dividing into 2, into 4, into 8, into 16, the first cell divides and they come apart, and then those two individual cells start dividing. So you've got two humans with exactly the same DNA, but that's not what we're talking about. Now, this happens in both male and female. So you got the male has one, it's called a haploid. He has one strand of DNA that is mixed up from his mother and daddy, and then his mother is contributing one strand of DNA that's mixed up from her parents. And so at conception, these two haploids come together to produce the two DNA strands that's in your body that determine who you are. So that's why you get traits from your mother's side and your father's side. Pretty cool, huh? That's how it happens. That's why you are the way you are. Mitosis is the DNA replication process for somatic cells. The meiosis is the gene shuffling process that makes an individual person out of two strands of DNA that were contributed to you at conception. And now you are contributing some DNA to your offspring. Only a single strand. They come together at conception, and then you have the two strands of DNA. What causes these mutations? Well, there's several things, and I'm going to be very quick. One of them is just a copying error. It's the cell's fault. When the polymerase copied the DNA, it made a mistake. Now, there's a mechanism in the cell replication, the DNA replication process that goes back and checks the DNA, and they catch 90% of the copying errors. So it's like having a little guy standing there checking against a checkboard or clipboard to make sure and if it didn't, the cell goes back and repairs it. Now, how cool is that? But about 10% of them make it through. That's called a copying error. Then you have mutagens, which are a wide range of things, can be chemicals, cigarette smoke, for instance. It's a mutagen. It's a compound that causes your DNA to mutate. And many other bad things. Cigarette smoke attacks your immune system, which is really bad. So you have that. Then you have ionizing radiation, X-rays, natural radiation from the universe, a lot of it. That's one of the unique things about our planet is that we have very little as compared to most places out in the universe. You would have get on a rocket ship and go 20 light years out in the universe and get out on your rocket ship to take a suntan, you'd be eaten alive by radiation. I mean, the universe is full of it. But here, not only it's something that we can live with, but it does cause cancer. But the ionizing radiation like X-rays and CT scans and stuff like that can cause, it can kill a mutated gene, but it can also cause one. Viruses. As we learn more and more, we find out that viruses play a lot more important role in this because a virus substitutes DNA. It actually comes in and implants its own DNA in your chain. And that's why you get the feeling so bad is because those cells begin to rupture and, they do all kind of crazy things and until your immune system comes in there and kills them all. And geneticists believe that a lot of that DNA that's been stuck in people over the years by viruses is still hanging around and has actually caused, some, quote, evolution to occur. And it's a pretty compelling argument. Regardless of how they get there, they're called genetic mutations. Now, I mentioned this before. A genetic mutation in a somatic cell, you know what that is? Somatic cell is not passed on to your offspring. If you've got warts on your arm because of the human papilloma virus, by the way, virus calls that, you're not going to have a warty kid. But if you have Parkinson's disease and that gene gets transferred during this gene shuffling process, you may have a child that has a problem later on in life. So in order for the DNA to be the mutated DNA to be inherited, it has to reside in a sex cell. 70 trillion somatic cells, a few billion sex cells. Making the odds a little more difficult, you see. Here's a formula for Darwinian evolution. Genetic mutation, right? We just talked about it. Got to have a mutation. No mutation, no evolution. plus natural selection and time. It takes a lot of time for this to happen because this happens one nucleotide pair at a time. And they propose that we get a new species from that. Not just a taller human or a faster Jack Russell Terrier, but something completely different. Here's a little example. I'm going to be quickly on this. This is called a peppered moth. This is one of the evolutionist's favorite examples, even though it's completely microevolutionary. Light ones and dark ones. Well, in England back in the early 19th century, they burned coal in all their factories and everything was covered with soot. And the dark form of the peppered moth did just fine because the birds couldn't see him against the soot-covered snow and rocks and everything else. But the white one had a problem. His predators, his natural predators, could see him. Okay, does that make sense? And they started taking advantage of that, and they ate them all up. They disappeared. That's called natural selection. But just because the moths disappeared, they were selected out because of the environment they lived in. It didn't turn them into something else. They didn't turn into blue whales. They're still moths. So that's an example that the evolutionist, if you ever hear that example, say, hey, that's microevolutionary, isn't it? That's microevolution. Give me a macroevolutionary example. Well, they can't do that. Now, amazingly, after they cleaned up the environment and, 50, 75, 100 years later, guess what? White guy came back and just the same numbers as was before. Now, here's the bird we're going to create. Archaeopteryx. Anybody ever heard of him? Archaeopteryx means ancient bird. I saw the fossil of that bird at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. There are 11 of those, 11 fossils. They're all almost identical. In fact, I looked at them all and they look identical. I can't tell the difference. Now, evolutionists say that this animal was formed from a theropod dinosaur over a long period of time by these little bitty single nucleotide pair mutations. And it creates what's called transitional forms. As you can imagine, going from a dinosaur to a bird leaves a lot of different funny looking guys in between, right? Half bird, half dinosaurs that got wings can't fly, things like that. There's got to be a ton of them. I'm going to show you. It's an amazing amount of them that have to be. So what is a transitional form? So that you'll know what I'm talking about in a few minutes. Well, the textbook definition is an organ features intermediate of its ancestors and progeny, all right? Animal A, animal B, there's something in between that's got a little, kind of features of both. And it also says the term is most common in evolution to refer to organisms that show certain features, wings, feathers, gills, and so on, partly in development. Now, most of the evolutionists don't really hold it too hard to that last part, because they'll call an animal a transitional form even though it's fully functional. It doesn't have a dead wing or an extra leg sticking out the top of its head. My definition down at the bottom is a transitional form is an organism that displays non-functional morphological parts, appendages, organs, and structures that indicate macroevolutionary progress or ceased evolutionary progress. It could be evolving a wing and then all of a sudden not evolving it anymore. So you got this thing hanging on, a wing hanging around. These must be clearly non-functional, since any functional part is something that's, it's completed its evolutionary path. It works. Can't call that a transitional form. So the definition is important because evolutionists typically say if I've got a whale and I've got some other funny looking thing like an alligator, well, everything in between the whale and the alligator are transitional forms, even though they all could do, they were all fine. Do you understand what I'm saying? If you're going to transition from a scaly dinosaur to a bird, there's got to be some pieces along the way that doesn't look like either one of them, and some of those parts can't be working yet. You got it? Now, all right, hey, a bird, what's the difference between a bird and a dinosaur? Well, a bird has feathers. A bird has extraordinary lung capacity compared to a dinosaur, probably 20 times the lung capacity. A bird has very light, porous bones. As opposed to a dinosaur who has thick, heavy bones because, T-Rex, can you imagine him with porous bones? A bird has a system of avionics. Balance systems that allow him to fly as opposed to scamper along the ground. Of course, a bird is a warm-blooded animal, and a theropod dinosaur was believed to have been a cold-blooded animal. Evolutionists tell us that there has to be at least 500 of these kinds of changes before we can make a new species. So somewhere along the way, a little dinosaur had to be hatched that had one of these little genetic mutations, one base pair, that created a problem on the skin. Can you see that pretty well? There's several different, look like teeth sticking up there, but that's an eruption. This is an example evolutionists use a lot. They think one of those scales came up and kind of curved, There's no way that a standard dinosaur could have laid an egg and the shell opens up and there's a bird in it. That just can't happen. At least it can't happen naturally. So as you look there, you kind of get an idea. The first little eruption of the skin, a genetic mutation, would create this little funny-looking little scale. That's about as much as you could do in one generation. Now let me show you something here that this is maybe the most important slide in this whole thing. We've got our friend theropod dinosaur up there, and he lays 6 eggs, or she, and one of them, the little green one, has got this skin eruption that I talked about. Now, she continues to reproduce, and down the road, she's got regular dinosaurs. The tan ones are just regular dinosaurs just like her, but the green one has got this skin eruption. That's the genetic mutation. Now that dinosaur with the genetic flaw is carrying that gene that we talked about, or that genetic mutation in his body, mates again. And this time, instead of having 6 standard dinosaurs, which she could, there's 2 with this showing this skin problem, okay? Now these 2 go off and they mate. And they continue this process for, I say, X generations. I don't know how long it takes. It takes a long time until, one of them is in a family with, or 4 out of the 6 have this skin problem. And then after another N generations, another period of time, look what you have. You've got a whole, they call them breeding populations, a bunch of guys that live in, Fairhope that are breeding and that are producing, everybody's got this problem. You can imagine that? And the guys up in Spanish Fork, they look like the regular dinosaurs. They don't have this problem. That's what has to happen. This genetic mutation must take over a breeding population, because if it doesn't, if that first green guy there in my chart, after he got up about this high and was eaten by a T-Rex, that was the end of it. That genetic mutation was gone. I mean, in the belly of the T-Rex, so it didn't get very far. They call that genetic drift. There's all kinds of different little roadblocks to keep what that looks pristine and happy, but there's all kinds of things going on in the environment that are trying to stop that. One of them being Mr. T-Rex out there eating these little guys. Now, if you can see that, you have better eyes than I do, but imagine now that our dinosaur with a skin problem has a worse skin problem, like the one I showed on the slide before. The eruption gets a little more and a little more until there's a little quill sticking up. All the things, he's got quills all over him. And all of a sudden, and then new genetic mutations create some kind of fuzz on the quill, and after a very long period of time, you have a feathered dinosaur. Now, there are claims that feathered dinosaurs have been actually found. The Chinese claim that, but they're notorious for frauds. They have a big business down there of faking dinosaurs, because you can get $2 million for one, so they do it. But there's a hard claim. In fact, National Geographic ran a story on one time and found out it was bogus, found out it was a fraud. And they really got down on the feathered dinosaur theory. Called it the equivalent of cold fusion. That's what they called it. So the National Geographic, you'll never find an article again about feathered dinosaurs in National Geographic, I suspect. But anyway, so now we have a dinosaur that has evolved a feather, but like, so what? He, doesn't have wings, he doesn't have any of that other stuff yet. Where does all that come from? Well, if you look on my chart, the next guy is porous bones, and the next guy is lung capacity, and the next guy is muscle structure, and the next guy is avionics and all. So somewhere else, other dinosaurs have to be evolving these things. And these have to be dinosaurs of the same species. They have to be able to mate and reproduce. So you couldn't have a theropod dinosaur mating with a triceratops that had porous bones. I mean, it's got to be the same species. Now, is this starting to get complicated to you? I mean, it is. It's horribly complicated. And how all these animals get together, and so the feathered dinosaur has to find the one that has the wings, so that by the way, a feather's an extremely complicated structure, whether you know it or not. I couldn't make one. And there's 5 different kinds on a bird. There's feathers for flight, there's feathers for insulation, for camouflage, for mating purposes. You see these beautiful feathers on these birds. And all of those things evolved as well, according to the evolutionists. So you got a flight feather, which is completely different from insulate, the down on a goose, for instance. But that's what they say happened. That's how it works, okay? Now, if I were to take that chart right up there and stretch it down another 500 lines going down, because it takes 500 of these changes to make a new species, and stretch it out to the right, thousands, maybe millions of generations, then you get to see how many transitional forms are littered about the area. I mean, there's millions of them. Everything in that matrix there, with the exception of the pure species, are transitional forms. So Darwin said, where's my book on Darwin here? Let me see if I can find it real quick. He said, now I'm reading from the man himself, but in proportion as this process of extermination, talking about evolution, has acted on an enormous scale, got that right, so must the number of intermediate varieties, that's transitional forms, which have formerly existed be truly enormous. Why then, here's the question, why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graded organic chain. And this, perhaps, is the most obvious and serious objection which can be judged against the theory. Now, he said the explanation, I believe, is in the extreme imperfection of the geological record. Now, he wrote that in 1859, and obviously the geological record is a lot more complete, but guess what? The intermediate forms aren't there. We find animals in the fossil record that are fully functional. They don't have dead wings or extra legs or gills hanging on them that are not useful. They are fully functional animals, which the evolutionists many times call transitional forms. A friend of mine and Jim Bradley's called a flying squirrel a transitional form. Well, if he couldn't fly, I'd say, yeah, maybe that's right. But a flying squirrel, you try to catch one if you want to see if he's hampered in any way. You know, he's fully functional. He's not a transitional form. If he jumped off a limb and fell flat to the ground because of all of that extra skin and hair on him, then I'd say, yeah, that's a transitional form. But here's one thing I'm interested in. Mathematics of this. Some pretty easy mathematics associated with this. Evolutionists say there's a 1 in 500 chance that a beneficial mutation will occur and be successful. Then they say there's a 1 in 600 chance that this beneficial mutation will take over this breeding population. Remember my little breeding population of all green animals? So that adds up, or that comes to 1 chance in 300,000 that you can have a genetically mutated breeding population. Now those numbers are so ridiculous to be laughable because we don't even know of any beneficial mutations in humans, sickle cell anemia, excuse me. And so, it's very difficult to say that there are 1 in 500 mutations. That's clearly wrong. All right, so we got 1 chance in 300,000. Well, that's not too bad. That's certainly doable. I wouldn't like to take those odds to Las Vegas, but Now, here's the big problem. You got to do that 500 times. So you got to multiply 1 over 300,000 by itself 500 times. Let's see what that number looks like. Did it come up? Oh, even in the computer won't do it. All right, I did this math myself, actually. I hope you're impressed. The answer is 1 chance in 3.06 times 10 to the 2750th power. Now that's That's a chance in a number with 2,750 zeros behind it. I mean, that's a number that cannot be described in the human language. And the probability theory states that anything with a chance less than one chance in 10 to the 50th power, that's a number with only 50 zeros behind it, is impossible no matter how many times you try. So this thing is just what I described to you, which is what evolution, and using their conservative numbers. It's mathematically impossible. And they know it. And their answer is, well, here we are, so it must work.
In the scriptures, Psalms 139 verse 14 tells us, I praise you, God, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are your works. Now, after listening to the description of DNA and how the cell produces unique individuals, how can one say it is not a work of great wonder? Certainly impossible by any human standard. Verse 14 goes on to say, and my soul knows it right well. I think that anybody that listens to what you've just heard with an open mind would be hard pressed to just ignore it and would say that or believe that this all occurred through chance and necessity.
There's even a bigger problem, and because we had to evolve the systems that we have, like eyes and ears and hearts and circulatory systems and livers and lungs and all that kind of stuff. All that stuff evolved the same way this feather did that I talked to you about. So even though an eye, which Darwin himself said it's absurd to even think this could happen, I wish I had that quote where I could find it quickly. You have to evolve an eye this same way, an eye that can see. But an eye is not vision. An eye is what I call a sense organ, a sense organ. It senses light and creates what, Grady? An electrical signal. It doesn't create sight, it generates an electrical signal. And that electrical signal follows what's called optic nerves. Now, optic nerves are almost as complex as eyeballs are. I'm telling you. But here, even worse, then these electrical signals have to be analyzed and converted into sight. You actually see with your brain. So then here's the occipital cortex of your brain, and it's got to figure out how to take this electrical signal and make vision out of it. Now, all three of these things are evolving independently at the same time. Does that make sense to anybody that could actually happen? And that's a fairly simple system. Think about your circulatory system. Blood goes to livers and kidneys, and blood picks up oxygen and picks up carbon dioxide and gets rid of it in the lungs. I mean, all these intricate interreacting systems, just no way that could happen. I mean, there's no reasonable explanation that can be given for it. As an engineer, that just blows my mind. Now, so what's our option? Special creation. The fossil record, the special creation, which we talked about, is design. God comes in and He establishes these creatures. Maybe He maneuvers their DNA. I don't know how He did it. It seemed like that would be the way to do it because that'd work. And He created the DNA. Special creation doesn't require a lot of time. It doesn't require big bunches of transitional forms. It can be done very easily. And the evidence in the fossil record matches special creation a lot closer than it does Darwin's theory. And Darwin himself couldn't figure out why we hadn't found all these transitional forms, because he said, hey, they're out there in inconceivably great numbers. inconceivably great numbers. That's Darwin's own words. We found none of them, hardly. I mean, there were very few that, in fact, no undisputed ones. We talked about the Cambrian explosion last week and how the scriptures say that life came forth from the seas and came forth quickly. One sentence. And that's what we observe in nature. 50 phyla of plant and animal life in a strata about this, geological strata about this deep, representing about 5 to 6 million years. On the other hand, the theory of evolution predicts long periods of time with tons and tons of intermediate examples. Now look, here's something else real quick. What we see in the fossil record is stasis. Stasis is like static, not doing anything. And that goes completely against evolution. Or it could go against evolution because you might predict some stasis. Look at these animals. There's a starfish been around 153 million years, same as it was 153 million years ago. Spider, hey, that spider is older than dinosaurs. That thing was around before dinosaurs, same as it is now. And you can see them there, horseshoe crab, bat. In other words, what we find in the fossil record, if we have an animal that we're looking at and we find way back in the fossil record that it existed, and most of that stuff is like insects and fish and hard-bodied things, What we find out is they've been like that for, forever. Look at this guy. Now, here's one of your favorite guys. This was written by somebody, I don't remember. It's like, let us consider the roach. For example, these reproduce very quickly and have very short lifespans, which is a perfect example for evolutionary purposes. What you want is something that reproduces like crazy and then dies real quick, and then their progeny reproduces like crazy, and then you just got them, infestation of them, and that gives you a lot more opportunities for these genetic mutations, right? Bacteria are like that. They remain the same for approximately 250 million years before the dinosaurs. So cockroaches haven't evolved, and they are thank goodness, Aunt Leanne. I mean, they are just like they were 250 million years ago, before T-Rex ever made the scene. Now, here's kind of conclusion. If you cannot, for any reason, believe in a creator God, if you're sitting in the audience and you say, well, I just can't accept God, well, hey, Darwinian evolution that's just right for you, because it's a plausible, natural explanation if there's no supernatural intervention of any kind, which the mathematics and the evidence in science says there just must have been. There's only one problem with it. It doesn't work, So if it puts you in a position as a person who cannot accept a creator God of believing something that does not work, of believing the impossible. And there have been a number of evolutionists, Dr. George Wall is one that comes to mind, that have basically said that. I can't accept a creator God on a philosophical basis, so I'm forced to believe in the impossible. I mean, he admitted what we've seen tonight. He was a guy that, looked at the evidence and saw what I just told you guys, and he said, I'm just stuck with believing the impossible. Now I wouldn't like that very much. Regarding the appearance of plant and animal species, the predictions of the scriptures are verified by the observed science, the fossil record, whereas the predictions of neo-Darwinian evolution are not. Evolution is a failed scientific theory. The Bible, the scriptures, give us a much more accurate scientific account of what we should find in the fossil fields. Cambrian explosion, life coming immediately after the late heavy bombardment, as quick as it possibly could, the Cambrian, the sudden appearance of the Homo genus of animals, guys like us, boom, just, you know all those big bangs I told you about, the four big bangs, one astrophysical and 3 biological. That's what the scriptures say, and science has verified it. I mean, incredibly. Why would God write in the scriptures about the Cambrian explosion? Because he knew one day we were going to find it. He knew one day some scientist would stumble across it. And Genesis chapter 1, verse 20, you can date it to the Cambrian explosion.
The sessions on the creation story and Darwinian evolution clearly show us the scriptures are correct in describing what science has recently observed. Without variation, the scriptures are confirmed by the latest science. But how? These words were spoken over 3,000 years ago. Any reasonable person would find this amazing. I certainly do. On the other hand, evolution does not match the scientific evidence in key areas identified by Darwin himself, as we have pointed out. And you should check this out for yourself. As a minimum, any reasonable person must conclude that the concept of a creator God is a valid one. Believers in a creator God have learned that the ancient words of God can be defended as truth, verified by science. This should serve to strengthen your faith in God's Word, as it has mine.